Welcome, everyone, to All Ears Podcast. I am your host, Pierrette, and I am so honored today to have Dr. Mark Soloway on my platform so we could delve into his journey life and his career. So let's have a round of applause for Dr. Mark Soloway. How you doing, Dr. Mark Soloway?
I'm great. Glad to be here and glad to discuss my many years doing this thing called urology.
See, guys, I am so grateful to have him here. So, Dr. Soloway, can you please explain to us your journey, how you became a urologist?
Well, it's indeed be a pretty long journey. I started my training in the area of after medical school, of course. I went to Case Western Reserve. I never graduated from college, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I went to Northwestern University for 3 years, and I did pretty well. Grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, so I went to the dean of admissions, and I made an appointment, sat down with him, and I said, since I was raised, I wanted to become a doctor, and this is the best medical school, and I would love to come here. So he looked at my grades, and he said, I'll tell you what. He said, if you keep doing what you're doing, you don't have to graduate from college. You can begin after 3 years of college and come to Case Western Reserve Medical School.
Wow.
So that was amazing. So right away, it was super. And so I went to medical school, finished in 1968.
Okay.
And then I went to Case Western Reserve, or University Hospitals of Cleveland, Ohio, for 2 years as a surgeon, general surgery, internship and first year in general surgery, just learning principles of general surgery.
Okay.
Very important, however, is when I was in medical school, a key thing happened. At Case Western Reserve, we had to do a project and write a thesis in order to graduate from medical school.
Okay.
I had no clue. What am I going to do? I've never done research. I mean, I was in high school and college. I never did any research. So by the grace of God, serendipity, chance, so much in life, I happened to see this neurosurgeon said, I have a project in my laboratory.
Okay.
So I said, that sounds good. I'll go do that. So I met Dr. Robert White, and actually there's a book about his life, which we don't have time to go into because he was pretty well known. His idea was to try and transplant eventually the brain into the body of another person. So in his lab, he had an isolated monkey brain that they isolated, measuring the blood flow, etc. I won't go anymore there.
Okay, this is crazy. Oh my gosh.
But at any rate, he said, I have a project.
Okay.
And what we want to do is we're going to teach you, remember, I'm just a medical student, to clip the middle cerebral artery in the brain of dogs and then later in monkeys. And we're going to see if you, called hyperventilate, so if you alter their blood flow to the brain in a certain way, maybe you can prevent a stroke being as bad as it would otherwise. That was his concept. So the key there is, though, I had to learn from him and from his residents, who were neurosurgical residents, how to open up the skull of an animal, clip the middle cerebral artery, which is really tricky. If you don't do it perfectly, you get bleeding and the dog or animal dies.
Wow.
So I was able to learn to do that. And I did the project, and it turned out great. In fact, I was able to publish it, and I went to a major meeting in Germany. This is now as a medical student.
So it only took you one shot, and you just did it so perfectly.
Well, then I learned to do it, and I could do it over and over again, and then do the study. So the point is, I learned I could be a surgeon, and it was cool. And I could do research. I would never have known that without meeting this Dr. Robert White and getting into his lab. So the next step is, while I'm doing my general surgery, urology looked like a great specialty for a variety of reasons we'll go into probably later on.
Okay.
And they accepted me into the program.
Okay.
Now, one of the things to mention is that you have to have heroes in life.
True.
And early on, when I did my residency, and I'll get back to the timing here, in urology, training to be a urologist, I met this man, Willett Whitmore. And he was really he was the first person that started the subspecialty of urologic cancer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York City. And I went to visit him. He was like so cool.
Really?
He was a great surgeon. There was a TV program about him many, many years ago.
I'll have to go look into that.
So then I went on to be a training academic urology, and during that course, I've had many fellow students, people from around the world. Here, just pictures of them, all different parts of the world, came eventually to study with me. So another very important thing happened along the way is I was able to, instead of going to Vietnam, so now let me clarify. So I remember I had medical school, and then after that, my 2 years of general surgery. And at that time, the Vietnam War was going on. And I did not get a number that allowed me to stay in my program. I would have had to go to Vietnam. But I applied to go instead to the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, part of the National Institutes of Health.
Wow.
5 people were elected from the United States to go to the surgery branch of the National Cancer Institute. So I was one of 5. So when I went there, I was in the public health service. Instead of going to the Army, Navy, Air Force,
That's what I was
it's called the public health service. So I actually had a uniform when I wasn't doing my medical stuff. So I was in the public health service. And actually, I remember I spent $25 to get a uniform from some guy who just left.
So $25. You hear that, guys? Oh, my goodness.
Because you had to have a uniform. Particularly when I would fly, you can go basically free
yeah.
if you're in military,
True.
right? So you had a uniform. But the crazy thing was at that time, I had a mustache. And at that time, in the military,
you're not supposed to have anything.
No, and your shoes had to be. But here I was a lieutenant colonel as a doctor.
Really?
So I was way up there, right? But I would go to Dulles Airport, and there are these generals getting on planes, and here am I, a guy with a mustache. My shoes were tennis shoes or whatever.
And you just rock right
and
there.
And they're looking at me like, who is this lieutenant colonel? Like, I would get the word. But anyway, that's a little off the subject.
Goodness.
So at any rate, while I was there, it was important. I was trying to figure out what project I could do.
Okay.
And at that time, bladder cancer was really, most people died. If they got advanced bladder cancer, we had no chemotherapy. Radiation therapy wasn't very good. So I was looking in this book here, just to show you, this is 1972 and 73 Journal of Urology. And if you looked in the books, you would find that the results of treatment of locally advanced bladder cancer was terrible. In fact, if you look and read those articles, very few people survived. In fact, the numbers were really very low, 15, 20%. Look at this. This is from a major cancer center in Buffalo, New York, called Roswell Park Cancer Center.
Okay.
And this is from Cornell in New York. These are outstanding institutions. And the bottom line is, they said that we need something better because only 10% of people survived this cancer, and most of them didn't even have surgery. So what was going to be done? So here am I at the National Cancer Institute.
Okay.
So my first year there, I did surgery, learned how to do cancer surgery. And then I started looking, what am I going to do? And I happened by, again, serendipity, chance, I'm reading articles. What am I going to do? What kind of project? Because the second year I had to do a project. Everybody did. So I read this article that if you gave mice this pill, not a pill, it's like a compound.
Okay.
Just like smoking causes cancer, if you gave mice this particular compound, they develop bladder cancers. So I said, hey, let me get those mice. And I gave hundreds of mice this compound and they ate it. And look at that, they developed bladder cancers, but 80% of them, just like human bladder cancer. All right, so now what am I going to do? Now I have these mice, and I could even take the tumor out of a bladder and put it into the hind limb of another mouse, because they're all identical twins, all the mice. They're genetically the same. and that tumor will grow. So I had both tumors in the bladder in mice and another group of mice where it was on the leg, so I could measure it.
So where did you get this concept of using these mice to just find out with the tumors and stuff like that? I mean,
I just read that article that you could get mice running around with bladder tumors in a cage, of course.
And then you just pick all the mice and you just sat there.
Well, what happened is to find out which one had cancer, to know that it was working, you just pick the mouse up, and if he pees and it's blood, you know he must have cancer.
Oh my
just
God.
like a human.
Wow.
So now what am I going to do? So now the next key part of this is this gentleman, Barnett Rosenberg at Michigan State University, had this compound called cystiamine dichloroplatinum, cisplatin now. And he said that this might work against cancer. He discovered this compound. And that was in 1965. So I'm at the NCI now in the early 70s, 70, 72 actually. And I went to one of the pharmacologists and said, I've got all these mice with cancer. Do you have anything new that I could test? And he said, well, we got this drug, cisplatin, but probably it will never be able to be safe to be used in humans. But here's a vial. You can give it to your mice. If they don't die, see what happens. So I was able to get a dose that the mice would survive. And then I would go and take out the bladder, and sure enough, if you could go back a few slides, backwards a little bit, there you go, perfect. So see, how do I know it worked? Then I would take out the bladders after a certain period of time, and sure enough, this mouse got the drug, no cancer. So you compared those mice that didn't get the drug, taken this compound, the carcinogen causing cancer, and those that taken the carcinogen, but you give the drug to, and a dramatic, either no cancer or much smaller. So I said, wow, this drug works for bladder cancer.
Wow. So from there, you created your own chemo treatments?
Well, with the help of a lot of other people. So I was at a meeting, and the key medical oncologist who does chemotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, when he heard me talk about this drug, he said, you know, we started giving this drug to humans with testicular cancer, which also was deadly. And we have a way that it can be safely given that they won't, the patients can tolerate it. So I said, well, it works in bladder cancer too. So and by that time I had already finished my residency, and I'd actually moved on to Memphis, Tennessee. And I started giving it to my own patients, and he gave it to his patients. And then we published, and here you see in the 1970s, this is my first paper on the mouse results, which it worked. And then said, you know, it works in mice, let's give it to humans. And then here's my first 13 patients that I gave the drug itself. Why did I give it? I'm a urologist. We don't give chemotherapy. You know that.
I know that.
But when I went to the University of Tennessee in Memphis, the medical doctors didn't know how to give this drug. But I did because I had worked with it. So I said, I'm going to have to get a nurse, and we're going to give this ourselves. So I talked to, experts around the country, and actually in Australia, and they were just beginning to give it also. So here am I, this young guy, this whippersnapper in Memphis, Tennessee, and I said, I'm going to give it too. And this is one of the very first publications, 13 patients. But remember, earlier I said everybody with advanced bladder cancer were dying. And now we have almost 50% the cancer was going away, or certainly growing much slower. And so I continued with that reports. And here's later on, in 1981, another report. So sure enough, this made a difference. And now, 40 years later, this is still one of the best drugs for bladder cancer. 40 years later, this drug, cisplatin, is used not only for bladder cancer, for many other cancers. So I was at the very beginning of this big story.
Wow, so this is where Dr. Mark Soloway comes in.
There we get started.
Wow, this is amazing.
So now what do we do next? Well, after I left Cleveland, I went to the NCI, and I left Cleveland. And so the next step, I took my mice. I took my mice from Bethesda, Maryland. I took them to Cleveland, and now I took them to Memphis, Tennessee.
So you drove these mice all over the state?
We drove the mice all over.
Oh, my goodness.
Yep.
Okay.
And I ran a lab. During my training and residency, I also ran a laboratory while I was in Cleveland at my training. And then in Memphis, I was also a practicing urologist, as you know me, and I had a laboratory going on at the same time.
Huh.
So while I was there, the next major project is many patients couldn't tolerate major surgery. So they got radiation therapy instead, which most people are familiar with. Many forms of cancer you can treat with surgery or radiation therapy. So I said, well, maybe instead of just giving radiation, we add this new drug, cisplatin, along the same time. So I said, okay, mice, you're the first one. So I did it with my mice. And sure enough, I was able to show that in mice, the cancers were much smaller than if you got radiation alone, if you also got this drug. So the drug was adding to the beneficial effect of radiation. So what do we do? If it works in mice, it's going to work in human, right? So then we started telling patients, we can give you this drug. And when we first got started, 11 of 13 of our first patients, when they had a pretty advanced tumor, there was no cancer at all after the radiation and chemo, which was better than radiation alone.
Wow.
So what do you do? If it works in your place, you try and get many institutions around the country to say, look, maybe I'm biased. Maybe there's something special about the water in Memphis.
Hey.
So we did a study,
okay,
and this was published in the Journal of American Medical Association, confirming our laboratory and our initial patient report that this is the best treatment. If you're going to give radiation for someone who doesn't want their bladder removed, you also give this chemotherapy. And still today, 40 years later, it is the guideline. This is what happens. If someone's going to have radiation, you also give this chemotherapy. So that's a very second study.
So it's better to combine both of them.
Exactly. Yep. So we don't stop there. As you very well know, people who get a bladder tumor, they are very likely to get another tumor once you get one. And there are several reasons for this. One is if you smoke cigarettes, it affected the bladder, pretty much like, if the sun exposes the skin when you're 20 or 30, then when you're 80 and 90, you get skin cancers. It takes a long time. So if you smoke cigarettes in your 20, 30, 40s, even if you quit, your cancer-producing compounds from the cigarette smoke that you inhale go to the urine, sit in the bladder, and cause a bladder cancer. And if you have a bladder tumor and you get it removed locally, you're likely to get another one, 50-50 chance. So that's one of the reasons people, once they get a tumor. But another reason could be just the surgeon didn't get it all. So we know that. But thirdly, there was a concept that maybe when you do the surgery, you go into the bladder, you trim out the tumor, that maybe some cells are left there floating around and they can stick on the wall of the bladder. So that was
create another tumor.
And create another tumor, exactly.
Okay.
So I said to myself, how am I going to prove that that can happen? So guess what?
Your chemo.
I have my mice, right? So what I did is I did a little study, and actually I did this study during my residency in Cleveland.
Okay.
So this is just from a report. One of the most challenging features of carcinoma of the bladder cancer, is its tendency to recur. And so we're going to do a little study to see. So what I have to do in the mouse is to do sort of what is done in the human. How am I going to make it look the same? So I did a very simple study.
Okay.
I took groups of female mice, and in one group, they had a normal bladder. I didn't touch the bladder, and I put in these tumor cells, and no tumors grew. On the other one, I just cauterized, like sort of what you would do surgery, just cauterize it, but no tumor cells were put in the bladder. So in other words, I took tumor cells from the mice, right, from the bladder. I put them in a dish, stirred them up, and then I'm going to put them in through a little teeny catheter into the bladder to see if those cells stick, right? So they don't stick if you don't touch the bladder. But if I cauterize the bladder and stick in these tumor cells, then 80% of the mice develop cancer.
Wow.
So that proves that if you leave these cancer cells floating around, even though you do your best to try and wash them out, they may implant on the surface. So what can you do about that? Well, you could put in a chemotherapy drug in the bladder. And this
for the tumors to be stuck on the wall.
Yeah, and to kill those cancer cells. And this became another guideline for bladder cancer. So this is the third research I did that changed the way people all over the world treat bladder cancer. So first was developing the platinum, this platinum drug to show it works. Second, the radiation and platinum work together. And this, that for people who get tumors trimmed out, you should put in a drug in the bladder afterwards to prevent or decrease the chance of another tumor. So let's go on from there. A couple of the other things I was lucky to do, and this just proved that this works in the clinical situation. So I also became very interested in looking in the bladder and how we can do it better. And fortunately, so before 1985, you weren't even born yet, but before 1985.
I was born.
But you didn't know anything about urology.
No, I did not.
So believe it or not, before 1985, if someone went to a urologist to look in the bladder, all they had was a steel instrument. They put them up in stirrups for a woman, and a man, they went through the penis, into the urethra, into the bladder with a steel rod to look inside.
Oh, wow.
That was the only thing we had until from the beginning of the 20th century until 1985. And someone in 1985 came to me in Memphis, Tennessee from Japan, and they said, we've developed a scope that can look in the bladder, but it's flexible. And no one had done that. So I said, let me see it. So here you can see,
Dr. Soloway loves to experience a lot of things.
So at that point, I looked a little different. And the crazy thing is, usually you would, again, if you're going to do it, you're all gowned up, etc. And here I am in my suit looking in the bladder with this new scope. And at that time, we looked directly in through it. We didn't have a monitor. And it's changed over time. But as soon as I used it, I said, oh, this is going to revolutionize. I mean, you could imagine, instead of having this rigid rod, particularly for men, you've got this flexible scope that's like putting in a little catheter, and you can see through it. So over time, that dramatically changed. And of course, that's still used now. Yes, when I first actually presented that at our national meeting, the urologist said, no, you can't see as well. We're never going to use that. But in about a year, people changed. And of course, it was so much better for the patients. So that's another little bit about my journey. One of the other things I also was quite an advocate of is the standard procedure of trimming out bladder tumors. Okay. And the bottom line there is kind of everybody did their thing. It was the Wild West. And I said, there must be some better way of organizing this. And there should be guidelines on how to do this better. So just like when you get on an airplane, the pilots, they have a checklist, right?
Yes.
So I said, we should have a checklist because really there's a very wide variability in the skill of this operation. Some people are good, some aren't good, but there's not a lot of documentation. So one of my fellows at the time, David Pan, and I wrote an article on the transurethral resection of bladder tumor checklist. So when you go to the operating room, there are certain things you need to check off. Is this correct? Is this correct? This is what we found, and made guidelines on how you should do this. And this has been now subsequently taken on by several institutions around the world, showing that if you follow this checklist, you're going to do a better job.
Wow.
So that's the first checklist for bladder cancer.
So you created this checklist back in 2012.
Yep, I did, and I still use it, and other people use it, of course. And now, towards finally that's I'm not ending everything, but also one aspect I also am proud of. So this is a typical bladder tumor, and when you look at this, you know that this tumor is not one in the wall. So this is not going to kill or metastasize, because the ones that grow in the wall look quite different. And particularly when the patient gets another one, they're much smaller. So the first tumor a person has when they have some bleeding, they have a larger tumor. But as you check them, because they're susceptible to another tumor, remember we talked about the carcinogen for cigarette smoke or whatever. So the next ones can be really tiny. Traditionally, urologists say, okay, but you have to take that patient back to the operating room and take them out. So you have to put them to sleep. It's a lot of money. It's expensive to go to the operating room. You have to be in the anesthesia, pre-op clearance, takes time away from the patient. He has to drive there, even though he goes home the same day. It's a big deal. So I said, first of all, is there a better way to do it than to go to the operating room? And two, maybe we don't have to take them out right away. So what we want to do with these low-grade tumors is we want to make it as easy for the patient as possible. So
that's why you cauterize the tumors.
So therefore, right, and this just shows with these tumors that these people don't die from this kind of cancer. This is one of the first of many, many studies, and that we've known for a long time that these weren't lethal tumors.
Okay.
So what I said is that is there a way that we don't have to rush these people to the operating room? Can we observe them? So if it's a little teeny tumor and the patient's 82 years old, it's not going to harm the patient. Let's just watch it. Maybe it'll take a year to grow. Maybe it won't ever grow. But no one ever did that. No one ever wrote a paper saying you can watch these tumors and you don't have to take them out right away. So I was the first person that said, it doesn't make sense. We have to take them out. And so I showed that if you observe these patients, that nothing bad happens. And this is the first article, 2003, 32 patients, I didn't take out their tumor right away. Everybody's looking around, my partner saying, Dr. Soloway, are you crazy? They have tumor. The textbooks say if you have a bladder tumor, you take it out right away. But I said, I know this is a low-grade, non-threatening tumor. So sure enough, not a single one of these patients developed an aggressive tumor, or certainly none of them died of bladder cancer by waiting a period of time. So this was the very first article. And shortly after that, many other people did the same thing, and there are about a dozen papers subsequently that show it is very safe, and hopefully many people don't have to rush to the operating room. So that was another thing that in my lengthy career that I was very proud of, that you can do active surveillance, just watch these patients and don't have to take out their tumors right away. And here's an example. Another choice is to just cauterize them in the office. And that, of course, saves the patient from going to the operating room, saves from anesthetic, and it's not very uncomfortable. It takes just, a few minutes, and that's it, done with. So that's a tremendous, avoiding the operating room, avoiding general anesthesia, huge cost saving for everybody, patient and the physician and the whole medical system. And this is just a paper I recently wrote that showed that this is a very safe way to go. One other thing I'm kind of proud of, and that is the periprostatic nerve block. So when I was in Copenhagen, probably 25 years ago, I learned about this ultrasound machine. And I had one of the first ones in the country where if you put this probe, you can put it into the man's rectum and visualize the prostate. So then we learned that we can do biopsies. And for many years, biopsies were performed without any anesthesia. So the patient, you imagine, put a needle into the prostate 10 or 15 times without any anesthesia
That is
at
very
all.
painful.
Oh my gosh, patients were counting. Dr. Soloway, how many of these doing? And they're sweating. But I mean, we did that for 10 years. Finally, in the year 1999, when I was at the University of Miami. John Obeck from Turkey, he was watching me do one. And I said, John, something is wrong here. You go to a dentist, the first thing he does is make sure you do not have any pain. Puts cocaine on your gum, puts some local anesthesia, waits 5 or 10, 15 minutes, then comes back and he can drill your tooth, and it's much less uncomfortable. Otherwise it'll be terrible. I hate going to the dentist. Oh my God. I don't even like the part where they put in the anesthesia. So he said, Dr. Soloway, he said, back in Turkey, some young guy was presenting something at a meeting where you could put a local. I said, find out. Wow, that's right. We could probably do that. So right away, we got a long needle. We put it in next to the prostate. And sure enough, it was a painless procedure. So that was incredible. That was the very first article on local anesthesia. Now, of course, within a year, people confirmed that it worked and it became routine. And lastly, regarding prostate cancer, I was one of the early ones that said, just like in bladder tumors, you don't have to take out a prostate or give radiation for low-grade prostate cancer. And we can talk about that later.
Okay.
So that changed things. So after it all, who suffered during all this crazy stuff? Probably my family a little bit. They were very encouraging and let me do my thing. And as a way of that, I was able to travel all over the world.
So you did. So you still had time to travel, even though you are the urologist and you had to work. Because I know physician works a long hours, so you had time to balance work and family at the same time.
Yeah, you have to. Your family is critical, of course. Everybody knows that. Family always number one. Sometimes it's number 2 or 3, depending on the day. Especially if you're called to the emergency room.
That's what I was trying to figure out. Like, how do you handle it?
Well, the family's got to buy in. Let's put it that way. There are a lot of people in jobs at policemen, et cetera, where you go out every day and your life can be threatened. So, they were very understanding, no doubt about it. And I'm proud to say that both my kids became doctors. So I guess I was a reasonable role model.
You did a great job.
Yeah. And then I play basketball. That's my get away from all this crazy stuff. So I'm probably the oldest basketball player still on this earth playing basketball twice a week.
And he's still a great job at it. He still do good. I mean, there's a lot of people that comes in and be talking about basketball with him, and he loves to talk about basketball. So if you love basketball, please go ahead and go look for Dr. Soloway. So, Dr. Soloway, it's amazing just to hear all these things that you have been created back in 1970s. And till this day, a lot of people actually still use the equipment and the products that you just mentioned. And I am amazed by that. I mean, I did a little research about you, but the way you go more in depth, I did not know a lot of that about you. And it's kind of amazed just to hear that the chemo treatments and, certain people who has a tumor in the bladder, it's majority of people who likes to smoke. But what about the people who don't smoke and they have tumors?
Well, it's a good question. There are obviously only a couple carcinogens we're aware of. Cigarette smoke clearly is the most knowledgeable one. There are other things, like there used to be in the building of tires, production of tires, several compounds that clearly cause bladder cancer. But they've been banned for 70 years. There are probably other people have secondhand smoke. We don't know how influential that is.
Okay.
And there are probably 30-40% of people with bladder cancer, men and women, who develop, and we don't know what the cancer-causing substance is. So the only thing you can do, and the reason why it's important to know some of them, is tell people not to smoke. So where we know it's a cancer-causing thing, we try and prevent it.
Okay. So how can people could tell, like, if there's something is going on that they need to go see a urologist?
Whoa. So there are many, many signs, symptoms, et cetera, why people would go to a urologist. First of all, if you have trouble urinating, that's a very frequently getting up at night, frequency during the day, burning, discomfort in the lower abdomen, kidney stones. A urologist, men with erectile dysfunction, difficulty having sex. low testosterone. There are myriad number of reasons that someone sees around the blood in the urine.
So I know that you mentioned all of the key points of why people need to see the urologist, but there's a lot of men out there, even though they see certain signs, they couldn't even tell, oh, you know what, I need to go speak to my primary doctor or I need to speak to a urologist. But sometimes most men thinking that, oh, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me. And then they wait till they get real drastic to the point of like, what's going on with me? Like, what kind of key points can you give to these gentlemen's out there, to especially for the erectile dysfunction? Because a lot of people who has ED, they couldn't even tell the difference, when they're having intercourse with their partners. How how can you tell these? Because it's all ages. Because it's most men thinking that, oh, you got to be over 50 and then that's when your ED is like certain things going on. But some kids like in their 20s and in 30s and they have ED dysfunctional. Is it because of most people who has ED? Is it because of people who are diabetic? People who is a part of the low testosterone that caused the ED? Like, what kind of make these men have certain problems with their ED?
Well, first of all, unlikely someone less than 40, 45 will have ED because of an organic cause, because of some reason for the blood flow not getting into the penis or the nervous system not working appropriately.
Okay.
That's pretty uncommon unless they have very low testosterone, which is pretty rare. So that's not a common one. As men get older, low testosterone can be, but usually that's associated with decreased desire for sex and tiredness. So it's more than just ED alone. Okay. So you're correct. Diabetes, high blood pressure, medications for high blood pressure can make it difficult for men to have a sustained erection. And the first avenue for treatment, of course, is the medications. We call them the PDE5 inhibitors, trade names, Viagra, Cialis, etc. They can be helpful. That's the first thing to use because they will help increase the blood flow despite the diabetes and hypertension that may be the cause. Just switching medication for